It's pretty wild to think about, but could a massive, centuries-old translation error have literally changed the menus for millions of people around the world? Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a really incredible historical and linguistic journey. We're going to peel back the layers of ancient texts to uncover what actually happened back in the first century. So, we're going to tackle a super common modern belief right out of the gate: the idea that the New Testament completely abolished kosher dietary laws. For centuries now, the popular understanding has been that the strict food regulations of the Old Testament were just wiped away. But, as you'll see, when we systematically peel back the historical and linguistic layers to reveal the reality of the first century, the story is actually way more complex. And honestly, it's a lot more interesting.
But first, to really understand the world of the first century, we have to define kashrut. These are the foundational rules of the era, found right there in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. They designated foods as either ritually pure, meaning fit to eat, or completely forbidden. For a land animal to be considered kosher, it had to have split hooves and chew the cud. Think cows or sheep. Anything outside of those parameters, like pigs or shellfish, was strictly off the menu. This was the absolute baseline of everyday life for the people we're talking about today.
Okay, let's move into Section 1, the hand-washing debate. We'll be unpacking Mark chapter 7 and the Pharisees.
To start our investigation, let's look at a really famous confrontation in the book of Mark, chapter 7. People often point to this as the exact moment the dietary laws were supposedly overturned. The setting is a tense debate between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees are upset, but what exactly are they upset about? Well, if we look closely at the text, their grievance is that the disciples were eating their bread with impure, unwashed hands. The crucial point here is that the Pharisees were arguing strictly about unwashed hands and extra-biblical traditions of ritual purity. They were not debating the actual menu itself. They were rigorously following this man-made tradition that required elaborate hand-washing, especially after visiting a marketplace, just to ensure they hadn't accidentally touched anything ritually unclean. It even extended to washing cups and copper pots. So they weren't debating whether to eat pork, they were debating the ritual preparation for eating permitted kosher bread.
Now here is where it gets absolutely fascinating. This is the climax of our translation reveal. At the end of this debate, a lot of modern English Bibles include a little parenthesis that says, "Thus he declared all foods clean." Seems pretty definitive, right? Well, prepare to be surprised. That specific phrase, "declared all foods clean," is completely absent from the original Greek text. It literally isn't there. It was actually added by modern translators to reflect their own theological assumptions. If we look at the literal Greek translation, the sentence simply ends with the phrase, "purging all foods."
So what does purging all foods actually mean in this context? The literal Greek text is just describing the biological digestive process to make a spiritual point. Jesus was explaining to the crowd that physical food doesn't go into the human heart. It goes into the stomach, passes into the colon, and is naturally eliminated, or purged, into the latrine. He was simply making a biological observation. The digestive system automatically purges the food. And this biological fact perfectly sets up his core teaching. He was pointing out that ritually pure food going into the body without an elaborate hand-washing ritual doesn't spiritually defile a person. What truly defiles someone is the spiritual sin coming out of the human heart. Things like greed, deceit, and malice. He took a strict legal ruling about hand-washing and completely flipped it into a profound lesson about the purity of the soul.
All right, let's jump into Section 2, Peter's vision. This is all about zoology versus sociology in Acts chapter 10.
Let's dive right into our next major piece of evidence, Peter's famous vision of the sheet lowered from heaven. This is another massive pillar people use to say the dietary laws were abolished. Let's look at the context, though. Peter falls into a trance and sees a sheet containing all kinds of animals, both clean and unclean. We're talking pigs, reptiles, the whole shebang. A voice tells him to kill and eat. Now, on the surface, sure, it looks exactly like a change in diet. But look closer. The Greek word used for kill actually implies sacrificial slaughter. This is a huge detail. Even if Peter wanted to, he couldn't have offered an unclean animal as a sacrifice. It would violate the absolute core rules of the temple. Peter himself protests, saying he has never eaten anything unholy. And this baffling vision happens 3 times in a row, leaving him incredibly confused. But the text actually gives us the explicit answer to the mystery. Peter doesn't wake up and suddenly ask for a bacon sandwich. Instead, a group of Gentiles, non-Jews, arrive at his door.
Later, when he's explaining the vision, Peter says it plainly. God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. The vision of the unclean animals, like the pigs, was actually a profound symbol. It was a metaphor for human beings, specifically non-Jews.
So the crucial point here is that this vision, it was about sociology, not zoology. It was a divine mandate to tear down the massive cultural barrier between Jews and Gentiles. In the first century, devout Jews often avoided entering Gentile homes because of intense ritual purity concerns. They were afraid of encountering idols or braves. Peter's vision was a mandate to overcome those strict taboos. God was telling him, do not treat these people as unclean. It was a monumental shift in human relations, not a change in the kitchen.
Moving right along to Section 3, Paul and the definition of food. We'll be navigating idol offerings and purity.
When we look at the letters of the Apostle Paul, we really have to contextually reframe our thinking. Paul frequently writes about all foods being clean, which causes a lot of confusion today, but to a first-century Jew, a pig was absolutely not in the category of food to begin with. It was an animal, sure, but it wasn't food, any more than we would consider a poisonous plant to be food today. Therefore, when Paul spoke of all foods being clean, he wasn't talking about pigs or shellfish. He was talking exclusively within the established category of permitted kosher foods.
So, what was the real debate? Well, early believers were living in a Greco-Roman world, and the issue they faced wasn't about whether to eat pork. The real issue was whether otherwise clean kosher meat, like beef or lamb, had become spiritually impure because it had been processed in a Gentile marketplace or potentially offered to pagan idols before being sold. They were absolutely terrified of contracting impurity by association. Paul was navigating this incredibly complex social dynamic. He was teaching that an idol is nothing and prioritizing the conscience and unity of the believers over ceremonial disputes about where the kosher meat came from.
To ground our explainer in the academic literature, take a look at this. Rigorous historical research by scholars like Dr. Gershon Nerl really highlights the intense struggle of maintaining a unique Jewish identity amidst these very debates. The first-century believers were working through massive semantic and cultural realities, just trying to figure out how to live together while respecting the Torah and integrating outsiders. So let's step back and review the evidence. The historical reality becomes pretty undeniable. The myth is that these ancient texts abolished dietary laws and declared all animals fit for consumption. But when we look at the original Greek and the actual cultural context, the entire narrative shifts. The texts were actually addressing extra-biblical hand-washing traditions, the groundbreaking inclusion of Gentiles into the community, and the anxiety over eating kosher meat that might have been offered to idols. It wasn't a menu change, guys. It was a profound transformation in human relationships and a reevaluation of ritual purity.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If a missing cultural context and a few translated words can change the meaning of a text this drastically, literally turning a lesson on human inclusion into a license to eat anything, what else in history are we misunderstanding? How many other historical truths are hiding just beneath the surface of a translation, just waiting for us to uncover the context? Keep digging, keep questioning, and never underestimate the power of context. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.